Hello everyone, welcome back. So in the last episode, we were able to even go further into React to explore the concept of props and states. And moving on, we are going to start working with our socket service now. So we are just going to go with the second point, which is to integrate our socket service. So we want to ensure that at least we are connected and we are able to use it. Alright, so back in our code, we currently have this snippets from the last episode where we were able to see how to use states and props. So for the case of what we are going to be achieving today, we need another concept called context. So with the introduction of React tools, we also get to see the context, React context. So initially we tend to use readers to manage our states. However, with context, we can just make use of context instead of installing a third-party library to help us do that. So we are going to look into context and see how we can achieve our aim with it. So let's try and create some state management. Then along the line, we get to understand what context is. So I'll create a different folder and I'll call it state management. Okay, so before we even start working on any code, let's quickly understand what context or readers is. So literally, context is, I would say, it's more like readers, just I would say a bit easier to use. And what they do is to ensure that you have your data within a central location, where you can easily pull it out or store in it whenever it's needed. And the real reason why you want to have context or readers implemented in your app is because whenever you are transferring parameters, so let's say you are transferring parameter from a parent to a child, it gets to a point where it doesn't really flow well again because the generation becomes so much. For instance, maybe you have like 5 parents transferring parameter from the top to the bottom. At that point, it's much more complex in the sense that there are parents in between that doesn't even need the parameter you are sending to them. However, you still send it because you have to get down to the child. So this issue are what we are trying to work on using context or readers. So with readers, you have your data in a central source and any of the child can just tap into the source and pick whatever data they need. And the parents, all he has to do is just put whatever data he feels like the child will need into that central source. And that's the concept we are going to be working on. And that's why we are using readers or context. However, we are not using readers, this is context. But like I said, they are literally the same thing. I will advise context though, because with context, you don't really have to install any external library. Alright, so with that said, let's jump into implementing this. So within our state management folder, I'll just create a JavaScript file and call it store.js. So within this store.js is where we want to define our store, literally. So, we need to import React since it's going to be a React file. So aside from React, we are going to need some other things. So we are going to need something called create context. Then we are going to need use reducer. Alright, so all this from React. Alright, then the next thing we want to do is we want to just set up our store. So we want to create a component, so const, then it takes in props as usual as a normal component. So now when you want to get information from your store, you have access to two things. So you have access to something called a state and you have access to something called dispatch. So the state is where your data actually resides in, whereas the dispatch is more like a controller that allows you update the store. So if you remember, when we are defining data for our use state, so we have the data itself there with the setter. So see the state as the data itself, where the dispatch is the setter. Okay, so for this, we are going to have a const that takes in state like we did for use state, then dispatch like this. And this would be equals to use reducer. Now, use reducer takes in reducers. So what's a reducer? So a reducer is just a function that allows you to send in data and it updates it with the store. So you literally interact with a reducer. A reducer is more like the connection between the store and the child or the parent that wants to use the store. So you send your data through the reducer to the store. That's literally what it is. And since we might have multiple reducers, so that we might want to introduce ourselves to something called combined reducers. So in Redos, we have this readily available as one of the content you can import in. However, I'm not going to be using any external library, and we are just going to create our combined reducers out of mere code. So let's wait on to that. So for now, I'll just leave this as a function. Then initial state. So your store needs an initial state, which we currently don't have. So again, let's just have that as a dictionary. So it can be a dictionary, it can be an integer, a float, or an array. So it's just a data. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to return a provider. Okay, so as a result of this, we are going to require provider, which we are going to get from some combination of things. So the first thing we want to define here is we want to define something called store, which is equals to create contests. So the create context we obtain from here. So we are using it to create a store. So this store actually is where your data resides, and it's going to take in it the initial states, which we currently haven't defined. So let's still specify it as just this object. So later on we are going to define the initial states. So from the store we've provided, we can now have access to the provider. So it's a key within the store itself at this point. So we can deconstruct the key. So we can have something like const provider. So by the way, you can have, so what I'm doing here is the same thing as saying store.provider. So this is what we call deconstruction. So you literally get a key from an object and have it like this. Okay, so we've gotten the provider now, and we want to actually return that as a component. So it takes in value, and the value is going to be the state and the dispatch. So these are the information the children and the parents components we are later going to will have access to. And remember, we already got access to the state and dispatch from here. So state, then dispatch. So what we actually want to return here is the children. So we're going to get to that how we pass children eventually. But the children can be obtained from props. So props.children. So we can have it like this. And by the way, we literally won't need more than children from here. So what we can just do is we can just deconstruct this as well and obtain the children key from it. And as well, we can remove this and change it to just children. So this is literally our store provider, and with this we have access to a React context hook. Okay. So finally, you want to export it. So we won't be using the default export because we want to export multiple things out of here. So we want to export the store. So the store itself is the state where every data is available. Then we have the store provider too. So those are the things we want to export from here. Alright, so we are really not done here. So currently we've not defined the combine reducers function. So what we have here is just a single function that probably takes in your data and store it on the store. However, I said we are going to have multiple reducers eventually. So as a result, we want to have a combine reducer function to do that. Alright, so to use combine reducers, we want to define a concept called reduce reducers. So it's just a term I come up with. And these reduce reducers, we take multiple reducers in and return a giant reducer, also known as a combined reducer. Okay, so let's create the reduce reducers first. So we have const, which is equals to, so it's going to take multiple reducers. So we can just spread them in here. Reducers, oh, that's not what I mean. So dot reducers. Okay, so it's going to have some information. So we have one of the information to be previous states, prev states, then the value, then argument. So most of the content here are quite abstract. So then we want to have reducers, which we are going to obtain from here, dot reduce. So reduce, it's one of those terms we have with ESs for our array. So we have map, we have reduce, we have filter, and others. So we are just making use of reduce here. Then we want to have the new states here. So literally, the way reduce function work is that it has an initial state, then tries to add to it. So literally, let's say you want to add the values within an array together. Then you literally want to use something like a reduce, because you have an initial value, let's say 0, which is our previous state here, and we want to just keep adding value to that previous state, and we return the result at the end of it all. So that's what we are having here. So however, this one is reducing a function, so we are going to now have a giant function at the end, and that's it about this. So now we can now define the combined reducer. So let's define that. So const, which is going to be equals to reducers, then a list of our reducer. So we can now specify our reducers within this space. So when we start creating reducers, then we can do that. So now we can just replace what we have here with the combined reducers, and that should do it. So now we also need to define the initial states. As we can see here, we are using the initial state both here and here. So it's okay to just have the initial state defined, and it's going to be an extension of objects. So let's define that too. So const initial, okay. Then we can replace this to initial state. Then this also will be initial states. Alright, so this is literally all we need to define to create our store provider. So the next thing we want to define now is the reducers. Okay, so let's create a new file for that. So reducers.js. Alright, so literally you can create different reducers for different activities you want to do. So for instance, maybe you want to manage your user information, you can create user reducers. Maybe you want to manage your chat information, you can have chat reducers, and others like that. However, I kind of come up with an idea of having all of them together, because reducers are not really very big, so we can as well just have multiple in the same place. Okay, so the first thing you want to do when you're defining a reducer is to specify the states. So one of the states I want to create, and that's what actually prompted the whole state management thing, is the state for our socket service. Okay, so let's define that. So we want to define a state called update chat. And by the way, you will notice that we are not defining React, and that's because the reducers are pure functions. They are pure JavaScript functions and are not React. And by now you should have taken note that React are actually JavaScript that has mixture of HTML in it. So that's actually a concept for JXX, JavaScript and XML, and that's what React is doing. So anywhere you see JavaScript and HTML mixed together, then that's a React component. However, whenever you are defining a pure function that doesn't have a mixture of JavaScript and HTML in it, then it's just a normal function. So as a result of this, we won't be importing React in our redux.js. Alright, so however, we want to create something called const chat update chat states. Okay, so we are going to see why this is the name we choose later on. So update chat, and it's a state. So the initial state for this is going to be false. So this is more like a container, but it's going to have the key in it, because that key is what you want to actually work with. And this key is going to be chat state, which is currently false. So this is the state. Now we need to define the reducer. So literally, like I said, a reducer is a function, so we can just say const. So, and by the way, when you want to define your reducer, you want to define it with a name replica to what you want to do actually. So for instance, the state is defined as update chart state. So you want to have your reducer defined as update chart reducer. And we are going to also get something called action later on, but for now, let's just move on. So you're going to take state and action. Actually, the state here is the initial state. It's currently the data within the store. So the state we are having access to here is the current state, whereas the action is going to contain the type of action we want to have, as well as the payload we are sending to update the state. Alright, so let's move on. It's a function, like I said. So now we want to check. So if action.type, so we want to specify the type of action before we can update our reducer. Like I said, we are going to have multiple reducers. So this actually brings about the way reducers work. So whenever you dispatch an information from your component later on, you are going to send signal to all the reducers you've created. So in order to recognize the one you want to update with, so that's why you need to specify the type. So we can now check the type. So we can literally just say if type is update chart, so that's the action, update chart action actually, let me name it action. So if the action dot type is update chart action, then that means we want to update this chart state or information. Okay, so we want to return the current state, which is the total state of the store, like I said. Then we just want to update the chart state in it, so which is this, because at the initial state is going to be false, so this is what we want to update, and we want to update this with the information or the payload we've sent alongside the action itself. So action.payload, so that's what we want to update our state with, but we are able to identify this by defining the reducer for it. Then if not, then we just want to return the state. So if this is not the action we've actually fired up, then we just want to return the current state. So that's how reducers work. So now currently we defined use chart action so as a string. So later on, that means whenever we want to actually dispatch this action, then we want to define this string again. So writing things manually can prove problematic in programming, and I'm pretty sure some of us have seen this again, have typographical error. So as a result, you literally want to just create a different file here and call it actions. So that's actually the three pillars of state management in React. So your actions, your reducers, and the store. So the actions are actually the variable for all the actions you want to perform, and the reducers are more like the identifier of the actions and the updater of the state, and the store is where your state actually resides in. Const action, which is, I'm going to define update chart action, and we can just make this equals to this. So this is literally what I meant. So because we are going to be using this chart action several places, we can as well just export it. So again, you can export individual content to like this. So you can export a variable like this, you can export a function like this, or you can decide to export it like this as well. Export update chart action. So this also works, so whichever you are comfortable with. So I just prefer using this inline. And back to our reducers. So instead of specifying it like this, we can just reference the update chart action we have here, and you can see it has imported it. So we can either do import, so we can have it like this, or we can just say import update chart action from dot action. Okay. So let's rename these actions. because there are going to be multiple actions eventually. And also, we are going to make use of these reducers, so the update chart state and update chart reducers within our store. So hence, we need to export them as well. So let's export it. Alright, so we've exported both, and now back to our store. The initial state we have here currently is just an empty dictionary. However, we want to extend it with the initial state for each of our reducers. So as you can see, the update chart state. So we want to extend it with this. So what we can have here is we can spread it. So update chart state. And what this does is literally just update the initial states with the chart state information, which is currently false. So currently now the initial state is an object that contains chart false as the info. And that's our updated, our initial state. Then also for the reducers as well, you want to spread in your reducers here. So use chart reducers. Update chart reducers rather. Alright, so like this. And that should be it. So that's all for setting up our store, reducers, and action. So in the next episode, we start making use of this and actually work with our socket service. Thanks, and see you in the next episode.